Hi, my name is Ashlyn.
My name is Juanita.
Today we will be analyzing an excerpt from the story My Antonia by Willa Cather.
This story was published during 1918, the year World War I ended, but takes place during the late 1800s.
During this time, the Homestead Act was passed, which allowed immigrants to receive free land in the Midwest in exchange for living in it for at least 5 years.
This was appealing to many European and Asian citizens, as many of them were poor and not allowed to own land in their own countries. This caused a huge wave of immigration.
The story takes place in Nebraska and features many immigrant characters like Antonia, Pavel, and Peter.
This story is also based on Cather's own childhood growing up in Nebraska. Cather's story begins with the characters Peter, Pavel, Antonia, Mr. Shimerda, and the narrator. From outside research, we discover that the narrator's name is Jim. It begins with characters all in a room where Pavel is extremely sick.
In the first paragraph, we start to see that Cather's writing style is very vivid. She uses a lot of imagery and adjectives to allow the reader to picture the environment the characters are in, as if they were in the story themselves. She uses phrases like, the firelight flickered, the wind shook the doors, each gust rattled the panes, and the coyotes turned up with their whining howls.
Cather also uses onomatopoeia to describe the sounds of the coyotes, as she says they yap yap yapped, and uses personification when she compares the wind to retreating armies or groaning ghosts.
They are worried by the sound of wolves, and Peter and Pavel's past with them. Antonia tells the narrator they are scared of wolves.
In this part of the story, Cather moves from describing the setting to describing the characters. She again uses imagery to describe the state Pavel is in. She describes his chest as emancipated and says it was covered in yellow bristle and rose and fell horribly.
Cather writes in mostly long sentences and uses many commas. This allows her to be very descriptive and slows down time, which helps build the quiet atmosphere.
Next, Pavel and Mr. Shimerda begin to whisper, which again places emphasis on the quiet atmosphere and builds anticipation as it makes the reader wonder what Pavel is saying.
Then, Antonia says the story is about the wolves and that it is awful, which draws the reader in. She builds suspense and excitement by describing Pavel's actions as he is telling the story. He says he raged and took his fist, and that Mr. Shimerda could hardly hold him in bed.
However, the mood again dims when Pavel begins coughing and bleeding. The scene is very vivid as Cather uses imagery and phrases like it was covered in bright red spots and uses a dash to input Jim's thoughts, further dramatizing the scene as he says he had never seen any blood so bright.
Then, Cather describes Pavel after his coughing fit is over. She uses similes like he lay fighting for breath like a child with croup, and his spine and shoulder blades stood out like the bones under the hide of a dead steer, and metaphors like we could see what a hollow case his body was, to describe Pavel's body. This makes it clear that Pavel is extremely sick and builds anticipation for his story, as it makes the reader wonder how impactful his story must be for him to have so much emotion even in his sick state.
This is where Pavel and Peter's story containing the wolves is introduced. After Pavel told Mr. Shimerda and Antonia the story, Antonia translated it for Jim, the narrator.
The author uses the lines, Antonia told me as much of the story as she could, to introduce the topic. The narrator also says that they talked of nothing else for days afterward, which builds anticipation for the story. We thought this was a good transition, and the next paragraph begins with a flashback to the story.
It was changed so it could read in present tense. Although it happened years ago, the author decides to change the point of view. The narrator alters his perspective to be unbiased and explain exactly what happened.
The beginning of the story, the narrator gave details of the wedding. She talked about how it took place in Russia during the winter, where lately many dangerous wolves had been seen.
In this first paragraph, Cather uses many commas and semicolons to give details about the wedding, which allows her to maintain her long sentences in slow, relaxed pace. Cather also uses very common language which allows the audience to easily understand and follow the story.
There were 7 sledges that held all the members of the bride and groom's closest relatives and friends. After finishing dinner, everyone is so full of food and drinks that they were not paying attention to the sounds and events happening outside.
In this paragraph, the author uses pathos and makes the reader like the groom and the bride by including sentences like, at midnight, the parents of the bride said goodbye to her and blessed her. The groom took her up in his arms and tucked her under the blankets, and the groom was absorbed in his bride. These descriptions set it up so that at the end of the story, the reader is more affected and has stronger feelings when the groom and the bride get thrown to the wolves.
In this paragraph, Cather also uses parentheses to include the narrator's thoughts into the story. While talking about the people present, Jim says, our Pavel and Peter, which shows that he's still amazed and surprised that this event actually happened to Pavel and Peter.
Then the wolves began howling and no one paid attention to them until the wolves had actually caught up with their sledges. The first sledge that lost control was startling and made the others aware by the screams. This was the beginning of the chaotic race to get away from the large pack of wolves.
Cather uses imagery here and is very descriptive in order to show a clear picture. The shrieks that followed made everybody sober. This shows the severe amount of danger they are in.
Another sledge was caught by the wolves. However, the author attempts to reassure the readers by stating the groom had the best team and their sledge was the lightest, and the others carried from 6 to a dozen people.
This foreshadowing helped the audience try to guess what happens next. More sledges are caught and the bride and groom are the only ones left. Peter and Pavel are the drivers of the sledge.
By including dialogue that interrupts the continuity of the story, it forces the audience to think about the consequences of being caught by the wolves.
They also go into more detail about the wolves when the text says, "They still come?" Pavel asked Peter, "Yes." "How many?" 20, 30, enough.
Pavel is thinking in a more self-preservational way for himself and Peter.
The text used ethos to get the audience to root for the last sledge to make it out from the wolves' control.
He decides to act on the idea of self-preservation and tries to find a solution to lessen the weight of the horses.
The text states, "He called to the groom that they must lighten and pointed to the bride." This shows how Pavel disregarded the woman and made a vital choice for Peter and his survival. The husband, however, did not agree and tried to protect his new wife.
Unfortunately, this act of courage resulted in him being the first one falling out of the sledge. The bride was then thrown out too. Pavel had saved himself and Peter, but hurt others to get there.
This brings us to the theme of the text.
The theme of the text, My Antonia, is actions have consequences. The main characters, Pavel and Peter, sacrificed the lives of the groom and the bride in order to live. This news was spread to many cities and towns, and wherever Peter and Pavel went, there were others who found out what they had done and turned the town against them.
Cather adds the phrase, "Pavel's own mother would not look at him," to make the audience feel sympathetic for the men.
Since they eventually moved out of Asia, they kept to themselves.
After leaving Russia, they worked in many different places.
Cather adds a list of detailed examples of their travels, like Chicago, Des Moines, and Fort Wayne.
This connects directly to the theme, actions have consequences, because Peter and Pavel's recognition forced them to move a lot. Being nomadic can make people live unhealthier lives, like how Pavel's sickness led to his death.
And his lifelong friend Peter had to make the decision of obtaining a dangerous job after Pavel's death left him alone.
Throughout the wolf story, it is shown that Pavel was the one who committed the horrible act, but Peter stayed friends with him because of his loyalty.
The next few paragraphs were a summarization of the outcome of Pavel and Peter's story. The narrator is back to his original character, Jim, and it took place a few days later.
He explains how Pavel died shortly after informing the other characters about the story. He also describes that Peter decided to sell everything he owned and went to work as a cook around Russian gangs after Pavel died.
The last paragraph is about how these actions impacted Mr. Shimerda, Antonia, and the narrator himself.
Mr. Shimerda was portrayed as depressed and fully aware of his friend's absence, while Antonia and the narrator decided to keep Pavel's secret forever.